I'm curious because have you guys ever heard? Do you guys know the route refiner fire? Do you guys?
Only
remember,
because I
remember
read
reading about
the
controversy.
summary that you sent us earlier.
Okay.
No,
Well,
I
there,
remember that stuff from back in the day.
yeah, like basically there's this route in the desert out in California out by Barstow. In the mid '90s, a climber does it, says, "Hey, I did this route, no belayer, same sort of situation," and it's 14B, which at that point is there's only one other 14B in the U.S. at that stage, and so
Super tweak.
Super tweak, exactly. And Randy Levitt, who we've had on the show in the past, calls bullshit. It's like, this is like, I've climbed with this person. They're not climbing at that level. This is like totally there. He writes a letter to Climbing Magazine. It gets published. Randy's like, I'll give this person $1,000 to come back out and climb this route. And, of course that, Boone Speed, who's at that time is like the strongest American climber, comes down, can't touch the route. It just like nothing adds up. And then suddenly someone takes a hammer to the holds and they disappear, and no one ever can like repeat this route again. And it was big enough that this outside magazine covered it, and it's there. And there are some moments where the community has come out and just been like, bullshit. We call bullshit. And it doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. And I think of it. It's just such a tricky thing, right? It's like, there are climbers out there that do have clouds that fall around that people do talk about. And it's like, is there a time when it is right to call bullshit on somebody? To say, hey, you're not actually doing a good enough job with your standards to like say what you're saying, right? And in the role that you have, you need to do a better job with this. Like, is there a moment for that? And why is that so hard?
Why is it so hard to call people out?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's just risky, right? And
it's slightly mean, like, what if you're wrong? Like,
yeah, I know exactly.
Like,
I think it's just, and ultimately, outside rock climbers, like, in some ways we're in competition with each other, but really not. I think that if it were a World Cup or if it was the Olympics, a lot of competitors would be willing to call somebody out if they knew that they were blatantly cheating, or if they had, put their foot on a bolt or whatever. And that actually does happen. But I think that in the realm of like outdoor climbing, the ethics are slightly different. And I'm not going to say that there's more respect, because I don't think that that's the right word. But I think that there's a little bit more, like, we want to give everyone an opportunity to tell their own truth and to trust them. And I think that they're, without like incredibly solid, I mean, here's a great example. There's several people in the last 10 or 20 years that have been speculated to be chipping boulders, existing boulders or existing routes, right? Eventually, those people, even though the whole community was very certain of who it was, those people weren't ousted until there was literal video proof. And I think that that is an excellent standard and a really hard one to accommodate, but it's kind of like, you don't want to suggest that someone's broken a law without having enough proof to get it through a judge.
Yeah, it's the same
and
standard.
The public
as
is our
system.
judge. Yeah, exactly. It's like you have to have beyond a reasonable doubt that this person has done something in order to make it public, because it would be incredibly unfair to them if you were wrong. If someone was wrong about that.
It's even different than, the sad thing about it is, I think why it is hard is that it is different from the legal system. Is like, you actually just get tried on Instagram or on the message
right.
board. You don't actually, there's no lay, one of my friends who's passed away climbing, Chad Kellogg, who was a kind of like sort of alpine speed climber, where he was like just an absolute beast of a human in terms of cardio. He broke the Rainier speed record, so the summit of Mount Rainier, and he broke someone else's record, and that person like would call into doubt the authenticity of Chad's claims, like from then on ever. And he always had, anytime someone would Google, there'd be this little thing following Chad around, even though everyone kind of was like, Chad did it. And it got to the level where it was just like, it was kind of this crazy thing where that just followed him around, and no matter kind of what he did, if, even if he took a photo, and it was kind of maybe like having a GPS watch, it was just hard for like him to escape that. And it wasn't even the community that was trying it. It was just like one person being like, no, it's not true. And it followed him around. And it was crazy to see that. And I think that is the damaging side of that whole situation. I mean, another example is like Uli Steck, right? On the south face of Annapurna, he does a solo of one of the hardest Himalayan faces in the world. There's no photos. He said, the camera gets dropped. His like watch doesn't work, but he wins the largest like alpine, the Piela d'Or, biggest alpine climbing prize. But there were questions about it, and it followed him around. And on the level of like when Uli passed away, 4 years later, it's in his obituaries. It's everywhere, and it's kind of wild when those accusations do get leveled. They really can just crush someone, and there's no real way for them to fight back against it.
I know. Well, that's the bummer of it, and that's why you have to be sort of careful about calling people out because, it lingers. I mean, the Uli thing always kind of bummed me out because it seemed like there were a few people who questioned the ascent and were very vocal critics. But in general, I never quite understood. I was like, why wouldn't people believe this? Like, it's totally in line with everything else that he's done in his career.
Yeah.
It's totally within his capabilities. It makes total sense. Like, everything about it to me, and other people climbed the mountain during the same weather window. It's kind of one of those things where you're like, it all, like, lines up pretty well, except that some people just don't like him and don't think that he could do something like that. You're kind of, I don't know. I mean, something I was just thinking about is that I think one of the true joys in climbing is when you exceed your own expectations or you sort of outperform yourself, when you do something that you didn't think you could do, or you sort of like take that leap forward where you're like, wow, I did something and I was sure that I couldn't, but I did. And I think that, that's one of the, and then it's one of the joys in spectating climbing as well, like seeing other people outperform expectations, being like, I can't believe somebody did that move or like did this thing, like jumps in human potential, jumps in human performance. And so I think that that's kind of the tricky thing with calling people out is you're like, oh, they did something that had never been done before. Do I immediately assume that they're lying, or do I celebrate the fact that humans are capable of so much more than I imagined? It's a tough, that's like the narrow line that you have to walk when you're taking people at their word, is you're kind of like, well, I'd like to believe that climbers are capable of incredible things, but I'm like, but is that person capable of that incredible of a thing? It's like, oh, it's hard to know.
Well, I wonder if that's why we don't call people out as a community that often. Like, if we were doing it all the time, it would kind of degrade that sense of like, but I like a world where it feels like we can trust each other to tell the truth most of the time. And if we were all just accusing,
where you can be surprised, where you can be like, wow, I can't believe that person did that thing. That's amazing. Like, I want to be amazed by other people's performances. And it's like, and it's a better world to live in when you're consistently impressed by other climbers than consistently trying to tear them down to whatever standard you think is possible.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and it feels like the examples of people getting called out generally, it seems like fall into like two camps. Like one, like this Randy example you gave, is like kind of something that feels really egregious, and then the other is kind of when it feels like something that someone has claimed or a misrepresentation is also like taking away from other people's climbing. Like if I claimed the first ascent to something, I could imagine that would feel really like hurtful to the person that actually did that. And then you'd feel like a little justified in like wanting to set the record straight because it actually kind of has to do with you. But most of the time I feel like we kind of just, unless it's one of those two things, like I feel like as a community we probably do let a lot of these things go and just let people have their like asterisks, and like moments of like, they're probably not a bad person,
When it does no harm, it's like, why not just let it go? It's like telling your partner that those jeans do look great, like,
that's why I brought up the example of the Olympics or World Cup earlier, because I can guarantee that if there was someone who was cheating constantly and they were always on the podium, and that means that other people aren't on the podium, I think that calling them out would be easier in some way, and I think it would be more accepted by the larger community, because the whole point of a competition like that is you ultimately want to see the best athletes win, and you feel robbed even as an observer if that's not what's actually happening. But when it comes to reporting outdoor ascents, one person doing really well doesn't necessarily mean that someone else doesn't. You know what I mean? Like it's a bit of a competition in some ways. It's pretty hard to deny that there isn't like some competitive element, but at the same time, like when Alex sends, it doesn't somehow like make me like not send. You know what I mean? And so it's harder to take things really personally, and it's harder to accept the personal risk that's associated with calling someone out and potentially being wrong, unless it's rock solid evidence that you have.
Or like, say you're a professional climber and it feels like you're going to get the boot from a sponsor and be replaced with some new climber that you have a feeling is lying, like now it's like your career and money, kind of the same way with the Olympics.
Sure.
You might be more likely to be like, oh, I don't really know about that. But most of the time, like when you lie, the biggest loser is you, and just that, exactly. Like you've lost like the respect of your community over time, like you're lying to yourself. It doesn't like matter, but it matters to you because you're the one that has to like go write in your journal that you lied to all your friends,